Okay, hello. My name's Mark Mandel, or Mark Mandel, depending how much American accent I put on top of my Australian accent. I'm a developer advocate for Google Cloud Platform and a new San Francisco resident. So it's really great fun to come and talk to you today. I'm going to talk to you today about wrapping Clojure tooling in containers. So we are at a Clojure meetup. We generally talk about Clojure, but while I am going to talk about some Clojure tools, I'm not really going to talk about Clojure too much. What I really am going to talk about today is this. So I'm going to guess I'm going to get a lot of hands. How many people here have heard of Docker? Good, good. We're all doing our jobs. So we all know what Docker is. Docker is a nice way to do software containers. It gives us resource isolation, really lightweight virtualization, all sorts of really fun stuff. How many ZSH users do we have? Not nearly enough. OK, so if you're not familiar with ZSH, it's an alternative terminal shell. You're probably familiar with Bash. It's what comes with your standard terminals. Yay. I like to think ZSH is better. It's OK. It works. There's nothing wrong with it if you're OK with that kind of pain. But anyway, yeah, I'll be talking about ZSH as well. Anything I'm showing here is ZSH. I'm sure you could find a way of doing it in Bash. That's totally cool. That's totally fine. But what I'm going to be talking about is taking like Clojure tools, primarily Lineagen, and wrapping it up in Docker containers in a nice way, and then putting some nice ZSH sort of silver linings or like pretty things on top of it so we can use it in a nice way, and it makes life really awesome for ourselves. So why on earth do we want to do this? Is it just that because containers are the new hotness? Is it because, you know, anytime you talk to anyone about hosting a website, they're like, the first thing you need to do is write a Dockerfile. So there are some reasons why you might not want to do this, which is totally fair enough. Lineagen's an awesome tool, if that's what you're using. I haven't actually touched boot yet. It's a lot better than a lot of tools you might find in other languages. Like if you want to switch Clojure versions, Lineagen's great, very, very easy. You don't have to worry about libraries, you know, overlapping with each other as you might do in some other languages. It handles class passes for you. That's all cool. But what Docker does bring to the table, which is quite nice, is several really nice things. One of which is simplicity. So I don't need to worry about the 14 different steps that I need to do to set up my tooling. I just need to download a Docker image. Awesome. It's also shareable. I can take my Docker image and say, hey, this is my environment that I'm building on. Here, you can have it too. Now, this is the environment you're building on. We have the same environment. That's awesome too. So that gives us immutability, yeah, which is something as functional programmers we all love. And we can pick and choose the parts of it we want to actually make mutable. You know, maybe it's our code that changes. Maybe it's different parts. It also gives us some nice resource isolation. So I might also be saying something like, maybe there's some extra binaries I need along with my normal tooling that I don't need all the time, but I only need some of the time. My coworker here, Francesc, is working on a project. He's doing it in Go. Let's not hold that against him. But he's working with FFmpeg. It's not something he wants to have installed all the time. So he just has it in his Dockerfile. Next time he comes back to that project, he might be like, I have to remember to install FFmpeg. No, he doesn't. He just fires up his Dockerfile, and his Docker image is ready to go, and it's all rare. Me personally, every so often I dabble with Clojure script, which means every time I come back to that, I think to myself, man, now I have to install Node. No, I don't have to do that. I can build myself a Dockerfile. The example I'm going to show here is very much probably a more one-size-fits-all, but there's nothing to say that you couldn't write a Dockerfile for your development tools that was project-specific either. So that would work in that sort of scenario. So these are all the nice things I like to think that this sort of stuff gives you. Now, it is a bit more work. I will admit that up front. But I think, to a degree, I think it's worth it. It's something to explore. So I'm going to show you what I've put together as a little demonstration so you can see what it is that I'm doing and how it works. I think I'm going to kneel. I think that's going to be the easiest way of doing it from here. But that's all right. I think that's as big as I can make it. Can people see that in the back? Awesome. So this is my terminal. This is on my host machine. I actually just realized I need to restart Docker because I just came out of suspend. Let me hope that's, nope, I can't type my own password. Demo God, something had to go. OK, so this is my host. I have no Lineagen, nothing. If I look at my Java version, I'm running Java 1.7 because reasons. So what I want is I want to be able to work with Java 8, and I want my Clojure tools installed. Now, the nice thing I have set up here is, generally enough, I have a container with those things set up on it. I also have a nice CSH function that I can call that'll say, OK, take the directory I'm in right now. I want you to mount that inside my container, and then let's run it inside a nice CSH shell. So let's do that. So I have a function I call line shell. So it starts up a Linigan shell. It fires up my Docker container and ports me into that CSH shell, which also has a slightly different theme so I can tell what's what. And let's delete my old stuff. Ignore that. OK, so I have nothing inside that directory. Great. I can actually see now I have Java 8. Awesome. Good step. I want to have Linigan. So let's just create a new Clojure app. We'll call it Hello World, because that's our example. And that'll run for 2 seconds. Linigan now works. So I've gone from having nothing to having something. If I have a look in Hello World, I can see I have files. I look in my project. I have stuff. OK, so very easily, very quickly, I've got up and running. If I come out of here, come back to my host, I want to have a look. There's my Hello World. So I've used some nice volume mapping inside docking we'll talk about a little bit later. If I go in there, have my project. Cool, my files are all there. So I've got that all lined up. If I go back into my line shell, starts up my container again. Everything is in there. If I want to run this, I can. If I get this the right way around. Oh, it's all right. I want to run this on port 8080. So I can then run line ring server headless. And that'll spin up my very simple Clojure application. Nothing too fancy. Now, while that's spinning up, for those of you who may not be as familiar with Docker, Docker does a really nice thing in that it will map exposed ports from the container to your local host. So we can actually go and have a look at what those are. So I've got 8080 inside this container exposed, so I can go look that up. So I come back to my host. I can write Docker port, and I can say, this is my container name. So that's the name I actually gave it. And it'll say, OK, cool. 8080, that's pointed to 32770 locally. If I have a look, and we switch tabs, which I already have set up. Make that. Yay, hello world. OK. Awesome. Yay. I like that response. So I've gone from having nothing on my host to being able to say, cool, fire up my Clojure environment with the tooling I want. So Linigan installed. It's actually got a profile.clj already mapped into it. It's got the Java version I want. And I haven't had to install anything on my host. My host is like totally, totally clean. Awesome. So that's really great. So let's have a look a bit at how that works. So how did we get there? So who here has written a Dockerfile? Most people. Cool. Dockerfiles are pretty straightforward if you're not used to them. Probably the most complicated bit of this is what is across the top, where it says from Java JDK. Basically, if you haven't written a Dockerfile before, this is like saying, what's my base image? Or like, where am I building from? So you can layer them on top. So what I'm saying is, give me the latest Java JDK from the official repository. And then I'm going to put stuff on top of it. From there, I do pretty simple things. I install Linigan as you would do normally. I wget it, and then I chmod it, and then I run it. Cool, pretty simple stuff. I make myself a project directory. That's what we saw before. I say that's my work directory. That's where I want to do my stuff. And I expose port 8080 in case I'm building web apps, because that's the port I like to put stuff on. So that's totally cool. It's worth noting that I have to set the environment variable that line root is 1, because when Docker's running these commands, it runs as root. Linigan otherwise goes, you're root. Don't do that. That's bad. Yes, but that's in the container. Yes, exactly true. Very, very true. And this is the very basic version of my ZSH command. Hopefully, I hope you can see that in the back. I can't make it bigger if you can't, so I apologize. It's consideration. I'm considerate. So a couple of interesting things here. The top line, I actually specifically make the M2 directory, so where my Maven repository sits locally. I do that because if I make it, that means I own it, and it's my permission on my Linux machine. if I let Docker do it, generally Docker will run as root on the host, which means that will be owned by root, which gives you permission issues, and it kind of sucks. The other fun thing I want to point out here, so Docker run runs my Docker image that I've created, and that's named Mark Mandel line shell, and it runs ZSH at the end. -v is volume mounting. So basically, take this directory from my host and put it inside the container for me. So I do fun stuff here where I volume mount, say, my M2 directory. So anytime I download dependencies, I don't have to do it over and over again. But the fun thing I really like is the second line from the bottom, which is -v. I'll pronounce it as p-word. I don't know how, pwd. Which is, and I won't take credit for this because I've seen a few people do it, and it's a really clever idea. It basically says, mount the directory that I'm in right now. So evaluate that as the directory I'm calling this command in, and mount that to my project directory. So I can be anywhere within my system, and I can be like, cool, I want line stuff now. Boom, and off I go. And that gives me a lot of flexibility. If I was building a project-specific one, I might hard code that to that specific project directory. But in this particular case, I'm not. So this works. This is not too bad. There is one small problem with this that I want to cover here because it pretty much hits a lot of people, is that Docker runs as root. If I'm mounting stuff in Docker, anything I create in Docker, the user in Docker is root. So if I create any artifacts doing this, they're all owned by root. And that kind of sucks. So it works. And if I created, say, like a line uberjar or anything like that, I would come back to my host, and it would be like, I have to ch own this. That's really annoying. Anything like that. That's really kind of frustrating. So, but we can solve this issue. This is OK. We can do some fun stuff with permissions to make this work. So rather than calling ZSH directly, what I like to do is I have a little startup script. This is one way I found that works quite well. And this is the startup script that we're going to eventually put in our Docker container. So the nice thing about Linux permissions, and I run Linux on my host and on my guest, so like if you're running on OS X, I'm going to assume this is probably going to work the same. Is if you have a user and you have a group, they have IDs. Pretty simple stuff. And as long as those IDs match up between your container and your host, everything's golden. Doesn't really matter what your names are too much, as long as your IDs match up. So I write a startup script that says, OK, whenever this Docker container starts up, I want you to create a group that has a particular group ID. I want you to create a user that has a particular user ID that belongs to this group. And I basically want to switch you over to running that user. Yeah, so nothing too crazy. Inside my Dockerfile, you can add files to Docker images pretty easily. There's an add command or copy, depending on which version you're working with. And I copy that into my root. That's all pretty straightforward, and then everything else stays pretty much the same. In my ZSH script, I set things up so I can pass through some environment variables. So I say, cool, what's my group ID? ID-G gives me my group ID, like for the current user. ID-U gives me the ID for my current user, which is me. I pass through my username so that I get consistency all the way through. So I've gone, here are my environment variables for my host. I've passed them through to my container when it starts up. I create my users. Great. It fires up. And now we have all the same permissions, which is great. So now if we create an uberjar or we touch a file or anything from within that container, I go back to my host. I can do whatever I want with it because it has exactly the same ownership. And that's golden. So we've gone from having nothing on our machines to having all our tools inside Leiningen. And we also now have all the same permissions, so we can run along nicely and build some stuff. That's great. Except for one small thing. Tooling. So you can actually see that is cursive. OK, you can see it on the screen. I was worried about the black text on the gray. What's on the left? The left, that is the logo for counterclockwise, which I had to pull from their Twitter account. I went hunting for that. So counterclockwise, Emacs, cursive, Vim, light table. Anyone still using light table? Interesting. It's OK. I was actually just curious. Anyway, I digress. OK, so we get to tooling. And this becomes a fun one because you go, OK, generally I run my tooling outside my container. But I don't have access to like line or my SDK. Uh-oh, that's a problem. So one solution is you could put all your tooling inside this container. That could probably work. That's totally fine. It may have been useful for some people showing Emacs earlier. I'm not going to name names. Just saying, If it was immutable, it wouldn't be an issue, but that's fine. You could totally do that. That's totally fair enough. I haven't tended to lean that way, mainly because I really like IntelliJ and Cursive Clojure. And I also find maybe if you wanted to have a particular tooling thing, you might want to actually have a separate Dockerfile for that wraps all that up and then keep it separate. I don't use Emacs, so I couldn't say for sure. So I leave that to those people. But I came at it and I was like, OK, so I run IntelliJ, I run in Cursive because I love Cursive and it's awesome. But I need to be able to get into my container. I don't want to be running IntelliJ inside my container. That just seems really heavy and bloated. And, so it's a little bit of a hacky solution, but it actually works really well. sshfs. So if you're not familiar with sshfs, most people maybe not. sshfs lets you mount file systems that you can access over SSH. Pretty straightforward. So if I can SSH into a machine and I have the permissions right, I can go in and I can mount any one of the volumes. So what I do is I go and I install SSH on my Dockerfile. I'm not going to show it here. It's about 4 lines. You can copy and paste it from docker.com. They give you the whole script for it. I set up a user, make sure it has a password. It's my user, funnily enough. And then I'm able to mount that. And it works actually pretty well. I'm able to access Java and all that sort of fun stuff. The one tricky bit I'll show you, and funnily enough, I wrote a ZSH function for this to make my life easier, called docker sshmount. What this does is you pass it the name of a container. It mounts it to /temp with the name of the container. It goes looking, that's just some funny ZSH stuff to basically parse the Docker port out of looking for that mapping like we were looking at earlier. So it says, OK, what local port does Docker put port 22 on? Tell me. And then I sshfs, I mount just /root because I just want access to everything because that makes my life easy. And the important thing to look at is the -o follow symlinks. I found this particularly useful running on Linux. The Java SDK has a bunch of symlinks in it. If you don't say follow symlinks, it tries to point those symlinks back to your host. And funnily enough, they aren't there. So if you put -o follow symlinks, then it points back to the container. Everything lines up right, and it can find everything it needs to find. So everything's pretty sweet. Question?
Earlier in the presentation, you're using volumes, mapping the things to make the things accessible.
Yes, that is a very good question, and thank you for asking that because I forgot to cover it. So that is a very good question. So if you didn't hear the question, which probably most of you will, but for the recording, why not just use volumes to map it? The fun thing about Docker is it just assumes that your host volumes are king. Like they are the penultimate of everything. So if you map a volume into your container, it will overwrite anything that it finds. So if I tried to map, say, to where my JVM was, it would blow away my JVM. So what I need to be able to do is say, OK, rather than me taking stuff from outside my container and pushing it into it, I need to be able to like pull the volume out of the container and pull it out into the host. So for that, I had to use sshfs. Otherwise, yeah, if I was volume mounting and then creating a file then after the fact and putting it in there from within the container, totally fine. That works. But if I'm just kind of just, as soon as I volume mount, it just clears it into whatever was on the host. Does that make sense? I mean, no, good question. OK, so cool. I'll show you how this works. I don't know if I can make the IntelliJ much bigger. It's in presentation mode. So I apologize if you can't see from the back. So what I'll do first is mount sshmount this. So docker sshmount. Where is it? Line temp. So I actually have set up inside my actual implementation of this, I automatically name my Docker containers based on the path it's on with dots to make life easy. So I can docker sshmount it. Tells me what port it's mounting on. Cool. So that's now mounted. If I go to temp line shell, have a look, I have access to everything. Awesome. So that's IntelliJ, which you can hopefully somewhat see in the back. I'll talk through it so you know what's going on. So the nice thing about Cursive as well, if you haven't used it, is it can import basically any project.clj automatically and understands how it works. So I've already looked it up. It's in my temp workspace, hello world project.clj. So I'll open that up. So that's not particularly impressive. That's just pulling files off my host. OK, but I need an SDK so I can do stuff. So we'll add an SDK. It's a Java, it's JDK. We're not going to use our local one because that's Java 7. We go into our temp directory. We open up line shell. Actually, I can type this a bit faster. Line shell, and we go into user, lib, JVM. And inside there, we will find Java 8. Awesome. Now it's found all the nice things. I'm going to give it hello world as a name, so I know that it's particular for this project. So, like I said, a little bit more extra work. But that now opens up. And it's indexing. So I'll wait for that to finish indexing. But I can work on this just as any other project. It's just, you know, some def routes from Clojure. It's nothing special. And I can work on this locally, especially because all my permissions are the same now too, which is great. So that's indexed. That's great. Let's just fire up a REPL because, oops, I don't want to create one. I just want to run one. Run REPL for hello world. That'll take a moment. There we go. So the cool thing here, if you can see down the back, you actually see across the top, I'm actually using Java 8 here. I don't have Java 8 installed locally, which is nice. And if I want to, let me just load that namespace, which has nothing very special in it, but just to prove that it works. Loading done. I have a look at app, which is basically a bunch of closures, which says nothing, but we can see it works. So I could run REPLs and I could do everything like I would do normally. So awesome. I managed to solve my little tooling issue. So that's great too. So great. So what have we done here? So we've gone from having a host that has nothing on it to being able to say, all right, great, with a combination of, okay, two things, some ZSH functions and a Docker shell, I'm able to spin up Lineagen and Java 8 wherever I want it in a nice environment that doesn't change, except for the bits of it that I want to change, and also keeps everything nice and contained, and I can share it around with all my team, which I really like as well. That's pretty much the end. So thank you very much for having me here, especially as a new resident to San Francisco. I appreciate having people come and listen to me. If you have any questions after we've left here, all my contact information is on my website at compoundtheory.com. I'm trying to hit 2,000 followers on Twitter, so I'm going to blatantly beg you to follow me. Please. And all the source code for this, with the way I've really implemented it all and all that sort of stuff, is at github.com/markmandel/.files. In there, there's a line shell, which has this here. I have a few other shells that I've built that I quite like. I've got a Go shell because I do some Go stuff. I've also got a Google Cloud SDK shell in there as well, and I'm sure I'm going to keep building them because I'm really enjoying this sort of development, especially as I bounce around between languages a lot. But otherwise, I open the floor up to questions, and thank you very much for having me.